Hello, class. I just wanted to make a quick recording of the Chapter 1 lecture PowerPoint for you to kind of have additional information to be able to learn the information from this class and to be able to complete all of the assignments. So I have switched the upload from a PowerPoint file to a PDF file. I will mention this in class, but if anybody wants the PowerPoint file, I can put that back. But I had added a link in here. And oftentimes these are smaller files that are easier for students to navigate. So without further ado, this is the first chapter. It is an orientation to the anatomy terms. For most of this is all anatomy. We'll start to get into the anatomy and physiology later, but the first section is anatomical terms, which is starting with position and directional terms. One of the things that you're going to need to know for this class, and it will come up many, many times over and over again, is what the standard anatomical position is. This may not sound like it is a specific term, the anatomical position, but it really is. So whenever there is any reference to structures, the way that they're facing, relative positions, anything like that, you need to know what the standard anatomical position is. When we finally get to go back to being live, we will actually do this in class. But for now, it is the body standing erect. The feet are slightly apart, about shoulder width apart, palms facing forward, thumbs pointing away from the body. So I believe there's a picture on the next slide that will show this. And then this way, when you have these directional terms, it'll show, you can explain or understand from words what the relative position is. I have a quick little video link here to a YouTube video that is a really good one that kind of explains some of these terms and whatnot to hopefully help you come up with ideas on how to remember them. This table 1.1-1 is the one of three tables that there are of these orientation and directional terms. And you guys can all read, but these examples show you this here. So superior is towards the head or upper structures. Inferior is towards the lower. Superior, I should mention, is also sometimes called cranial, and inferior is sometimes called caudal. So sometimes there's additional terms that are used to explain the same thing. That's one of the things that you're going to need to know from this class. What I recommend for all of these is that you go ahead and make flashcards with these terms, what they are, and the definition. And then as we proceed through the material, you'll find that there are several different examples. All right, and then below that we have anterior, which is also referred to as ventral. That is toward the front of the body. And then posterior or dorsal is towards the back of the body or behind. The next table has additional terms. Medial is towards the midline, as you can see in this diagram here. Lateral is going to be away from the midline. And then intermediate would be a more medial and more lateral structure. So this can be relative to something that is not in a central location, or there's two of. All right, and then moving right along. The third table includes the last four terms, which are proximal, which is closer to the origin of the body part or point of attachment of a limb to the trunk. So we'll kind of start to get into this a little bit more when we start to talk about the skeletal structure. Distal is farther away from the origin or body part of the attachment to the limb or trunk. And then you have superficial, which is towards the body surface. That is external. We talked about that a little bit in the Kahoot that we did on Monday. And then deep or internal is away from the body surface and more towards the internal of the body. So those are some terms. Like I said, I would make note cards or flashcards for each one of those to be able to remember what the terms mean. All right, for major divisions of the body, this was another one that was one of the Kahoot questions, which I forgot to share that Kahoot. I think I forgot to share it. I will share that again in the material. But axial is the head, neck, and trunk. That is the axis. If you think of axis as the center of something, that's what the axial division is, we'll talk about the axial skeleton, which is going to include the skull, the rib cage, and the spinal column. And then appendages are your limbs. So this includes your legs and your arms. And then there's going to be regional terms that designate specific areas within the body. This is the diagram that you were given the blank one to complete, and it's in your lab manual for the first one. So this one kind of gives you some regional terms to designate specific body areas. And then that was, of course, the anterior version, and this is the posterior or dorsal side, the different regions that are located on the back. So we will go through those further in class. All right, next section is body planes. And these are, if you were to hypothetically slice through the body, what are the different structures that you would see? And you need to know that reference point for where that slice is. So the three most common ones are sagittal, frontal, or coronal, and transverse or horizontal. And we will look at what each one of these are. For sagittal, this divides the body vertically into right and left parts. I'm going to jump forward to the picture and then I'll come back to this one. Oh, maybe it doesn't have it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So mid-sagittal, you can see here, it's a slice from top to bottom right through the middle of the body. So let's go back to sagittal. This, like I said, cuts into right and left parts. So you need to know what that would look like in that diagram, and then also the explanation of what that is, because you may have either a picture or the terms when it's asked in a question. Mid-sagittal is when it is perfectly on midline. Parasagittal is if the slice is off center. So you could move that slice either to the left or the right, and that would be a parasagittal plane. The frontal or coronal plane is going to divide the body into anterior and posterior parts. And I'll just kind of jump to this picture here. So this one would be this center one here. So you have the anterior portion is the front here, and the posterior or dorsal portion is the back there. Then transverse is going to divide the body horizontally into superior and inferior parts. This is also sometimes referred to as a cross section. This would, for example, let's just jump to the picture here. Shown here where this transverse plane is, you would, if you were to kind of cut the body in half and open it up, you would see the probably intestines and maybe the stomach through this area. So this is often used to be able to see the internal components within a certain section. And then you can also have an oblique section, would be kind of at an angle. So let me just kind of draw a line for what I mean. So your transverse would be 90 degrees to the vertical plane. So that's like that. Whereas an oblique section would be kind of at an angle. All right, get my mouse back so I can move ahead. And then, of course, we went through those pictures and looked at these different ones. All right, the body cavities is another section that you're going to need. There's two sets of major overall body cavities that are the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. And then you have kind of sub cavities within that house the various different organs and components. So in the dorsal body cavity, you're going to have your cranial cavity, which encases your brain. And then the other one in the dorsal body cavity is going to be the vertebral cavity, which of course houses your vertebral column and your spinal cord within that. And this diagram is showing you here in yellow. You can see through the legend here, the yellow portions are the dorsal body cavities, which we just said cranial and vertebral. And then you have your ventral body cavities that are in this kind of pink color. And these are going to include your thoracic cavity that includes your hearts and lungs, you only have one heart, your heart and lungs, and then your abdominal cavity that's going to include your digestive viscera. We mentioned in class, anytime you see visceral or viscera, that is referring to organs. So this would be things like your stomach and your intestines. And then your pelvic cavity is going to contain your urinary bladder, your reproductive organs, and your rectum. And you can look at these from different angles and see that they are very different. All right, so we just kind of went through all of these in that section, so I'm not going to repeat that. But in the thoracic cavity, there's two pleural cavities. Anytime you see the word plural, it's not the term meaning more than one. Here it's spelled P-L-E-U-R-A-L, refers to the lung. So the pleural cavities are going to be a separate cavity that surrounds each your right and left lung. Then your mediastinum contains your pericardial cavity. Anytime you see cardial, you should think of your heart. And then, oh, it says it right here. Pericardial cavity encloses your heart. So your mediastinum kind of includes all of that in there, as well as the thoracic organs like your esophagus and your trachea, which is your windpipe that leads to your lungs, which we'll talk about more when we get to the respiratory system. I think that might be in the 212. All right, and then I already mentioned your abdominal cavity. So the abdominal pelvic cavity would include both of these. So sometimes you can refer to them in a more general sense. Like I mentioned, your stomach and intestines, but also includes your spleen and liver. And then we already talked about the pelvic cavity, including your urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and your rectum. All right, within your PowerPoints, there's just kind of some little tidbits of information. We're going to talk about homeostasis in the next section on this class, which is maintaining normal parameters within your body despite changing external conditions. And this one is giving an example of something that can go wrong, where you have example of hiatal hernia, which is where the stomach protrudes and can actually push the stomach acid into the esophagus, which is sometimes referred to as GERD, esophageal reflux. You might see it as that also, but commonly referred to as heartburn. So you could see either one of those. So there can be other reasons that that occurs, but that's just one example. All right, and then continuing with the ventral body cavity, the serosa is also called the serous membrane. This is a, so this is referring to specific names of the membranes, and we also had one of these in the Kahoot questions. So they're thin double-layered membranes that cover surfaces, and your parietal serosa is going to line the exterior part of the internal body cavity walls. So we'll look at a picture here because I'm sure that sounds very confusing. And then the visceral serosa is going to cover the inside closer to the internal organ. So remember I said every time you see the word viscera or visceral, you should think internal organs. And then these two layers are separated by serous fluid, which acts as a lubricant for any movement that occurs in these organs. So we're going to look at an example here with the pericardium, but these are names for specific cavities and the organs that they're associated with. So pericardium is surrounding your heart. Remember I said cardio means heart. Pleurae is your lungs, again, P-L-E-U-R. And then your peritoneum is going to be your abdominopelvic cavity. So a lot of terms. This is get ready for learn the new terms. Like I mentioned, I highly recommend you make some flashcards with the term on one side and the definition on the other, so that can help you start to learn these terms. Whoops, I'm trying to move this bar so that I can zoom in a little bit here. So this is showing you here the parietal pericardium. So remember I said your parietal layer, your parietal serosa is going to be the outer portion of the membrane surrounding it. And then you have that space with the serous fluid between it. My little spotter's too big here. That's pointing to that lighter blue section in between. And then your visceral pericardium is the darker blue that is immediately next to the heart, or touching the heart. So that's examples of parietal, external layer, visceral, internal layer of the membrane. All right, let's see if I'm back out enough here. Okay, here's another example of one of those that's kind of like a case study type of thing. That's the name I was trying to think of. This is sharing that sometimes serous membranes can become inflamed. It can be from an infection, or it can be from allergic reaction, anything like that, or other causes. It can be mechanical, something that's wrong with the fluid allowing that lubrication. And this is where they can stick together, and it is excruciatingly painful. An example is pleurisy, which is pleur, again, P-L-E-U-R, the lungs, and inflammation in that lining around the lungs. My dad actually had this a few years ago, and he said, agreed, gave personal experience that it is excruciatingly painful. So that's one of the kind of clinical applications of where you can see this. All right, the last section is going to just kind of talk about quadrants and regions. These are going to be just ways to refer to different areas and refer to what organs are located in those different areas. And so I'll just kind of jump to the picture here. It's showing you your right upper quadrant, your left upper quadrant, your right lower quadrant, and your left lower quadrant. So this kind of shows you, you know, where the intestines are down here, and then you have where your stomach and your pancreas and all of that are up on the top. You can break this down even further and talk about the different things that are located in these different areas. So move on. My box is in the way again here, apologize. So this one shows you just a little bit bigger breakdown, and you can kind of see the different, trying to get this zoomed in here. Regions that are located in here if you were to make those sections a little bit smaller. So this bottom picture is really helpful because it shows you reference to these different regions, what is located in these different regions, and gives you the specific organs that are located in there. I forgot to mention in class yesterday, I will be preparing a study guide for you for your exams and for your final exam, so that it gives you a little bit more specifics on what you need to memorize in your note flashcards and things like that. All right, oops, I didn't zoom out far enough here. Let me go here. And then some other body cavities include your oral and digestive cavities, which is, of course, going to be your mouth is oral, your nasal cavity, which is going to be in your nose, your orbital cavities, where your eyeball sockets are, is an example of that. And then your middle ear cavities, of course, your ear. Then you have synovial cavities. Synovial fluid is fluid that is contained in synovial joints, which are freely movable joints. And that acts as lubrication for those bones to slide past each other, which we'll get to later on in the session. All right, so hopefully that was helpful for you. I am going to go ahead and stop this recording and get this video uploaded for everyone. I will see you soon.